Hello everybody and welcome to a new edition of Jan's Opening Clinic, the very exciting format where Chess24 Premium members can ask me their opening question and I mock them for their poor questions, or in the very best case scenario I might give some advice that some might consider useful and some less useful. Anyway, we got quite some questions. I'm excited about it. We haven't done a clinic for quite a while. Last time I was whining about my own problems. So I always thought it was better to learn from other people's problems rather than my own. So let's get right to them. I hope this setup, which I carefully prepared, works. And yeah, it looks like we can see some questions here. Let's start with Mr. SK3. He's asking, thanks to Jan. Thank you. Can I say Caro-Kann is French defense improvement? When I play advanced variation, the black c5 is really annoying. What time should I take on c5 or just defense it as much as I can? Thank you. I'm not 100% sure I get the question, but I'll do my very best to answer it. First of all, I'll bring a chessboard up, which should help us. So after e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, this is the advanced variation. His question is what to do about c5. And I'm not quite sure if it's a general question or if it's about c5 in this very position. In this very position, c5 is a theoretical main move, slightly less popular than bishop f5, but still quite playable. White has a couple of ways to play. dc5 used to be the main line. I always thought this was critical stuff. Knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4. I've always been a friend of the move c3 here. I thought that was interesting. But that's a very concrete line, and I'm assuming not what you're asking for. After c5, white doesn't want to play c3. He wants to play, directly with dc5 or knight f3 as a move here, or c4 as a move here. But I think the question is more of a general nature, how to deal with the later c5. And my first thing is, I hear your point. I believe the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann is very popular, and for good reason, at the highest levels, because this extra space in the hands of a super grandmaster is worth something, arguably more than black having his bishop out. But even at a slightly lower level, even at my level, I find these positions a bit easier to understand and play with black. I mean, you get your bishop out, you go e6, you prepare c5, you set your pieces up accordingly, and it's not so easy for white to play. So my advice would be, as dumb as it might sound, if you don't feel comfortable in these positions, how to deal with the later c5. And there's no good answer really. It all depends on the specifics. Don't play the advanced variation. Play something else. Either play knight c3 here. Those positions are a lot easier to handle after d, knight e4, bishop f5, knight g3, or knight d7. Well, there's some theory here. But both of them are easy to play. Or another favorite of mine, the line Paco Vallejo is always recommending, knight c3, d5, knight f3. I think both of those are better suited to play without being a huge expert in the subtleties of some half-closed position, and while still giving you decent chances for an opening advantage. So, to answer the question, I don't necessarily think that the Caro-Kann advance is a better version for black than the French advance after e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, but I do think that the Caro-Kann version is easier to play for black, and it's quite tough in practice unless you're a super grandmaster or an expert theoretician on these lines to figure everything out. So my advice would actually be to not go for it if you're not comfortable there, and you have some other quite decent options against the Caro-Kann. I hope that kind of answered the question. If it doesn't, apologies. Sorry. Let's move to the next question by Mr. Sushi Boy. Sushi Boy, I'm sure you've asked a question before. He's saying, "Hi Jan, it seems hard for black to obtain winning chances in the 5 bishop f4 queen's gambit declined. What do you think of 6b6? Let's bring up our board again and try to find that question. Not that question, that position, because I diligently prepared for all the questions, of course. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Did I put it under a different move order? Maybe I didn't prepare that diligently. This can only take hours. I found it. Knight c3, bishop e7. This is the queen's gambit declined with bishop f4. And first of all, I'm never a big believer in the logic it's hard for black to create winning chances. This might be, once again, true at super grandmaster level if white sets out to force a draw. But does it ever happen in your practice that you play this opening and you think, okay, I played a great game, but it's just hard to generate winning chances here? I'm not really subscribing to that theory. Of course, you can always argue, and rightly so, that the King's Indian makes it easier to get a counterattack and a dynamic game. But I wouldn't say that if you play one of the main moves here, knight bd7 or c5, the game is immediately dead and a draw. I don't think that's true. Still, the question was about b6. That's a move I used to think was underrated here. I'm not sure. It does carry some surprise value, so you could count that on the winning chances front. I'm not so sure about its true value anymore. It looks like recently black hasn't been doing very well. Normally, bishop d3, I think this is a critical move. Normally the idea is to capture on c4, bishop takes, and now either go bishop b7 or bishop a6. Bishop a6 I don't like. Magnus Carlsen played this recently, but he suffered quite terribly against Ding Liren and barely managed to draw, but it didn't look nice. So bishop b7, I believe, is the critical move. Castles, knight bd7, and I think white is a bit better here. White goes queen e2, both hinting at bishop a6 and at preparing e4. So a6 is the normal way to play, stopping bishop a6 and preparing b5 and c5. When after rook fd1, I couldn't really find how to equalize. b5, bishop d3. And here the problem for black is this position looks harmless enough. It looks like you're even in time to get in c5. Sometimes it's deceptive, even in these symmetrical structures. White still keeps a bit of initiative. That seems to be the case here. After, for example, knight to e5. So objectively, I think b6, well, is rightly not the main line, and knight bd7 rightly is. And I think there's some winning chances after knight bd7. But yeah, b6 certainly has some surprise value, and it's not a bad move. It is very playable, so I wouldn't say don't go for it, but I would not promise better winning chances after b6 here than after knight bd7. If you want to play the queen's gambit declined, I think it makes sense to go knight bd7 here, and if you don't like the character of the play, which is perfectly legitimate, you say it's too quiet and too slow and not enough tension and tactics, then it's probably better to look for a different opening. It doesn't have to be the King's Indian, it can be the semi-Slav, which I used to play, which is sharper, the Nimzo Queen's Indian. A lot of openings out there, but the queen's gambit declined in nature, it's a solid opening, trying to hold your ground in the center and gradually develop the pieces. Still think there's enough potential to win the game there, but it's hard to recommend a move here and say this gives tremendous winning chances or this doesn't, because the position is what it is. Let's see what else we got. Let's Beast. Let's Beast keeps crushing me in Banter Blitz, so I should give him some false information, hoping to win a game next time. But I think he's already trying to hurt himself with the line he's playing here. Saying, "Hi Jan, I have a question regarding the Cambridge Springs in the main line." That's not the main line, but we'll get to that. Knight d2, bishop b4, queen c2, castles, bishop e2. After dc4, I think the main move is bishop takes f6, but what do you think about bishop h4? I tried it a few times, but after b5, castles, knight d5, I usually end up in trouble. Any idea how to play this? Thank you. I'll bring it up on the board. I'll give you the short version. Don't play it. Here's our board, and I will try to find that position. That's the problem with opening clinics and my obsessions with move orders. I never know under which move order I store stuff. Here we are. So the Cambridge Springs, which for starters I'm not a huge fan of. I think it's playable, but I don't think knight d2 is the main line here or the critical test. Everybody is playing c takes d5 nowadays, and for very good reasons. After knight takes d5, both queen d2 and rook c1 is a trendy move, seem to give white the initiative. Black has been struggling a bit here. So if you're looking for a white weapon, I'd rather spend my time on checking cd5 here. Knight d2, yeah, the problem is black can go dc4 at many junctures, even here, and I don't think white has very much. So bishop b4, queen c2, castles, bishop e2, dc4, this is the line you were mentioning. By the way, I don't think dc4 is the main move here. I think c5 was also holding up just fine for black. Or h6 and c5, I'm not sure. So dc4 here. And there's a reason I checked this position in the database that pretty much everybody plays bishop takes f6 here, and no one goes bishop h4. Bishop h4 is just not good here. It's a pawn sacrifice, but normally if you give up this pawn in these semi-Slav kind of positions, you at least want some concessions from black. So black was forced to go h6, g5, and you have something to attack or something along these lines. This bishop h4 here, b5 just looks good for black to me. Castles, and you gave the move knight d5 and said you had trouble against that one. Which I understand. I think knight d5 is a good move, and I think black is doing fine here. Best move seems to be knight d to e4, and at least it can get a bit complicated, something like f5, a3, and it becomes a bit of a mess, even though I think black is fine, even bishop e7. But I'm not even sure, that's my point, that knight d5 needs to be played. I could be very comfortable with the position after bishop b7 here for black as well. If white goes a4, you just go queen b6, and black always has a very simple plan of going a6 and c5. And yeah, I wouldn't give up that pawn. I don't think white has enough for it at all. So, long story short, don't go knight d2, go cd5, and if you go knight d2, don't go bishop h4. Take on f6 and play this slightly boring, but arguably slightly better for white position. Something like this is playable for white. Mr. Let's Beast, sorry for the bad news. We'll be moving on to Arkham Asylum. Is that the Batman jail? It is, right? That's the place where they keep the Joker and those guys locked up. Arkham Asylum is saying, "Hi Jan, what do you recommend black should play after d4, knight f6, c4, g6, d5? That's actually an excellent question. I've never really looked at it, so it got me thinking, and I couldn't come up with anything obvious. Maybe I should look at it from the white perspective one day. Maybe I shouldn't, I'm not sure, but it's not such a stupid move, especially against players who want to play the Grunfeld, which I guess this is directed against. After knight c3, play d5. White just stops that mechanically. The thinking, I believe, used to be that it can't be any good here because black still has two ways to undermine or attack that pawn. White's not ready for it. And when checking it a bit, I couldn't find anything too obvious. Not that black is in trouble or anything, but it didn't look like you could exploit the setup so easily. So the best I could see was just to play like this in kind of King's Indian style. After bishop d3, go e6 or c6. try to undermine the center. I like e6 the best, but I'm not gonna claim that this is all that exciting at all. So I think such a position is absolutely playable for black. E6, knight f3, knight a6, but I think it's also absolutely playable for white, and I was actually surprised by that. So it's a good question, and I don't have a great answer, I'm afraid. I have to look at it some more. I have a funny answer, but I'm not sure I can really recommend this. You can try the move b5. This was once played by Safarli, who's a pretty decent player. b5, c takes b, a6, some kind of turbo Benko gambit where the black pawn is not on c5 yet, so that could be an option, but I'm not sure I'd play it myself. It's just something that I thought was interesting. Knight c3, bishop g7, intending to castle, and maybe even go c6 one day, or e6. I'm not sure I'd do that. I'd probably play quietly with bishop g7, d6. But it's not a bad line, and I was surprised to see that. I'm going to have to spend some more time on it before I can give a smarter answer. I don't have one right now, so thanks for pointing that out. And thanks for pointing out to me that we're not really covering the Grand Prix final right now, so what we're gonna do is change the text live on air. This is gonna be a very exciting event for all of you guys watching to opening clinic. Did I misspell it? Nah, it looks kind of okay. Here we are. So yeah, I don't have a great answer. I'm sorry. This is a gap in my knowledge, something I've never looked at. d5, bishop g7, knight c3, castles, e4. It's not a problem for King's Indian players, because they, after knight f3 or bishop d3, they can just play e5 and get their usual positions. d6, not really a threat. But for guys who want to play the Grunfeld, this position is not that simple. It looked to me like ideas with e6 and then knight a6, knight c5 are the most logical way to play. But yeah, it's not easy. So thanks for pointing it out, and I'll take a mental note. I'm not sure what to do about it, gotta be honest. Let's move on. Arkham Asylum. That is a place I keep the Joker, right? Yeah, there's some computer game. Arkham something. Anyway, I'm probably not on topic here. What's the next question? Ali H 9999. I played Ali H the other day in Banter Blitz. I think I won. Did I win? I'm not sure. Ali H is saying, "Hi Jan, is there any way for white to get advantage in this Sveshnikov 995 line? After 11 c4, b4, knight c2, a5. I can't find anything. Thanks." I think you can't find anything because there is no way. Now let's bring up the position, follow our procedure. Here we are. So the Sveshnikov. I'm not going to claim a lot of expertise on the Sveshnikov. I played it a bit like 10, 15 years ago. Wasn't to my liking, not because it's a bad opening, but well, frankly, I always disliked bishop b5 here. That move annoyed me a bit. And secondly, the Sveshnikov is a very committal opening positionally, so it's not really my cup of tea to play with long-term weaknesses, but I think it's still a perfectly sound opening and completely playable. d6, bishop g5, a6, knight a3, b5. In my opinion, the critical test here is and always has been, or, well, the line with bishop takes f6, I was gonna say, but then I kind of changed my mind mid-sentence. I'm not sure what the critical test is nowadays. They've also been trying a bit of knight d5, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6, and now c3. There were some interesting games. Anish Giri and won a nice game against Alexei Shirov. Looked to me like the thing black does nowadays is something subtle, like play both bishop g5 and knight rook to b8. Looks like here there are some discussions ongoing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure anybody knows a way to get an advantage against the Sveshnikov, like with most mainline openings. There's ideas and discussions in certain fields, but there's not necessarily an advantage. Anyway, you asked about the line c4, b4, knight to c2. Which, yeah, this was fashionable for a while. I never understood why. And Ali H gave the move a5 I believe nowadays it's considered to be more accurate to start with castles, because you can't take on b4 yet. So black keeps some extra flexibility by not taking just yet. This position seems to be totally fine for black. Queen b6 here. I was trying to keep the extra pawn once with knight d3, but then white is close to losing actually after queen d4 already. So that's not a good idea. So just a small side note, I don't think black needs to start with a5. I think he can start with castles. And if he does go a5, what white normally wants to do is go g3 and h4, restrict this bishop, and then put his own bishop on h3. I'm not sure it's enough for an advantage. Looks like it's not actually after castles, h4, bishop e6. Black has been holding his own. And I don't really see why black should be worse. I mean, this square is just as weak as this square. And white has given up his good dark squared bishop. So I don't really see the grounds for why white should be able to get an advantage here. In general, I think I agree with Ali H that, yeah, there's no advantage in those lines. So try, in my opinion, try the more trendy stuff with c3 here. White is making some progress in some of these lines with castles, knight c2, bishop g5, a4. Looked like black was under pressure. And that's maybe a better place to look. But the Sveshnikov is a good opening, so no line is going to promise an automatic advantage. Did I answer one question with what people would like to hear? I'm not sure. Let me just check in with the chat for 1 second. If anybody can see me, if, yeah, the audio is fine, the video is fine, the tie is fine, all the important questions. So shout if you can hear me. Looks like there's something going on at least. We shall find out. I'll move on to the next question by Bruce Lee 32. I keep asking Bruce Lee 32 if that's the day Bruce Lee died. I'll find out now, so I don't have to ask in every show. Not Bruce Jenner, Bruce Lee H. Yeah, he died at 32. That's what I thought. Wow, that's young. Not 27 club, but that's still young. Anyway, hi Jan. Nowadays the main line against the Petrov is probably 5 knight c3. After 7 bishop e3, I've tried recently the move 7 c5 with the idea of going d5 later. What do you think about it? Thanks in advance. Let's bring it up and then trash talk it. I don't think that's any good. I'll say that much. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, knight to c3, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop e7, bishop e3, and the move c5. I believe this is too much. This is a bit of a positional concession. The d5 square becomes weak. And I said the idea is to get in d5 later yourself, but I don't think black is going to be in time. There's a couple of interesting options. Bishop c4 looks like a very logical move. But even if white does what he normally does on these lines, to play queen d2, tending to castle queenside, I believe that he's just better. Queen d2, let's say knight c6, long castles. Black already is a tough choice. I'm not sure you want to castle kingside here, because then white does his usual thing with, I don't know, h4, h5. And maybe the idea is bishop e6, preparing d5, but, well, black spent an extra tempo on c5, and I think white can use that. Maybe knight g5 here immediately, question that bishop, and it just looks to me like white is better. If you go d5 here, you might have gotten in your d5, but even such a position after knight e6, fe, it's better for white. He just has a very safe shelter for his king. He has the 2 bishops. He can bring this bishop out to attack the e6 pawn. So, long story short, I like the thinking behind it. I mean, it's a fresh idea, c5, let's control the d4 square and then get in d5. It's very creative. I don't think it's good in this particular situation. But I like the approach, like, okay, black has this problem, how can we solve it? And that's the way to make progress in the opening. But I just can't get myself to believe in the move d5 here. Sorry, in the move c5. So I believe, yeah, this line is a problem for black, but I believe he has to stick with the classics, go knight c6, bishop e6, queen d7, and long castles, or go short castles and try to weather the storm. Neither of those have been refuted, but I will say that I think it's easier for white to play, and that it's for a reason that the Petrov is now a lot less popular than 10 years ago, when all the top players, or a lot of them, were playing it following the lead of Vladimir Kramnik. Moving on to the next question. Axel Banzias is saying, "Hi Jan, what do you think about the Jaenisch-Schliemann variation for black? I'm terrible with names, so I'm gonna assume that's the move 3f5 in the Ruy Lopez. I think it is. I switched for it because I didn't find a dynamic way to play against the exchange Spanish after 3a6. Any idea? Thanks in advance. It helps a lot." I'm not sure it will. We shall see. Yeah, I have some opinions. I'm, as usual, skeptical as towards a lot of the sidelines, but actually the Jaenisch, I really hope we're talking about the same thing. I think you mean the line with bishop b5, f5. This is a line I've actually tried to make work myself. I was interested in it. I had similar problems. The exchange variation is a bit dull after a6. I'm not really a Berlin player. Would be nice to be able to spice it up a little here. However, the more I looked at this, the less happy I was, because it just looks like white has a lot of options and he's not really risking all that much in anything. For example, I started looking at lines which aren't even that popular, like knight c3, fe, knight e4, knight f6. And here, to take on f6, when in this position black has to play queen takes, queen to e2. And it looked like it was some sort of slightly worse Marshall gambit, where you have to give up a pawn after, let's say, bishop e7, bishop takes c6, and then try to make a draw in a position like that. And I wasn't sure if that was enough reason to play 3f5 if white even has options like that. But it looks like also in the topical lines there are some problems for black. Like everybody plays d3 now, and fe, de, knight f6, castles. This seems to be the trendy stuff. And I couldn't really find anything I liked here for black. Bishop c5, I think you just take on c6, b takes c, knight takes e5. This is the line they're playing. And I didn't manage to equalize or find something I liked. Castles, knight c3. So I'll give you that it leads to sharper play than a6, especially against a player who's played the exchange variation all his life but doesn't strike you as a theoretician. It might be a good try, but the problem with all these openings, if you don't trust them, then people will catch up and start preparing for them after 1 or 2 games. While, yeah, if it's good enough and you can play it more often, I'm all for it, but I decided I did not like it enough. However, it's a serious line. I mean, Rajabov played it a lot of serious players are playing it, so I'm not going to trash talk it. I'm just saying that I decided for me it's not quite worth it trying to spend more time to make it work, because it seemed like white had too many good options. What I meant to show is that in this position they started going knight a4, which seems to be a problem. Earlier after d6 they were playing knight d3 and black was getting enough compensation with bishop d4. This knight a4, there were some recent games. I didn't like the way it looked for black, so I decided it's not for me. However, I do understand the problem, and all of us e4, e5, a6 players have spent a fair amount of time being annoyed by the lack of excitement here. It's no problem theoretically. Bishop g4 is fine, but to spice it up is admittedly not easy. Queen f6 is also fine. A lot of moves are fine. The sexiest line was always the move knight e7 here. I'm not sure how good it is, but it is a way to try to spice things up a little. Knight e5. Not queen d5. Let's go queen d4. And if you get this line with queen h5, g6, queen g5, bishop g7, at least things could get exciting. This is quite a fun line. Not sure how good it is for black, but it is a way to spice it up in similar vein as the Jaenisch or Schliemann or whatever we call it. So long story short, I think f5 is a respectable move. I decided for myself I don't like it, but I have no problem with having it in the repertoire as either a surprise weapon or maybe even as a mainstay at all. It's one of the playable moves there. It's probably inferior to a6 or knight f6, but it has some surprise value for sure. So I'm not against it for a change. Some very loud German folk music playing from outside. I think that's gonna spice up the show quite a bit. Let me just check the chat for 1 second. Jack Bauer sees me. I'm not sure that's a good thing. You want Jack Bauer to see you? He kills a lot of people, doesn't he? Anyway, that's good. Looks like we're up and running, and I'll move on to the next question by Outramer. Hi Jan, my question is about the Sicilian with white. I started to play the Rossolimo/Moscow variation e4 c5, knight f3, knight c6, d6, bishop b5. In the lines with the knight on c6, white is a choice to take or retreat with the bishop. I'll put it on the board in a minute after both d6 and e6 on black's part. What do you think is the better choice? I have some opinions on that too. Shouldn't show you guys my desktop. There's all my hidden secret files. So I'll once again switch to the board. Here we are. Sorry, this takes a while. I'm still becoming more proficient in switching windows. So the question was, in these two positions, after e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, should white give up the bishop after d6 or e6, or should he keep it? And as usual, my answer is, it depends. Of course, generally I'm a friend of bishops. It always breaks my heart to give them up. I believe after d6 here, well, bishop c6 is a bit of a sideline. I don't think that's very good or very scary. After b takes c6, if black will give him one more move to play e5, he'd be totally fine. So normally white tries to go e5 here, but I think black has been holding his own here. Bishop e4 was a move, even funny looking. f6 seems to be okay. So I believe after d6, bishop c6 is not such a serious option, and white should play this castles. How does the line go? Bishop d7, rook e1, knight f6, c3, a6. Bishop f1, I think that's what they do. I think this is what white should play, and he has decent chances to gain an opening advantage here, in my opinion. This d6 stuff has always struck me as a little slow, because black tends to spend another move on bishop d7. By the way, if black doesn't spend that extra move and he goes a6 here, of course, I change my opinion. If black wastes the tempo, by all means, take on c6. So against d6, I believe, yeah, it's better to keep that bishop. Against e6, it's a matter of fashion and taste. Both moves, bishop takes c6 and castles, are absolute main moves. They shift in and out of focus and fashion here. I've always had a very hard time understanding this position after bishop c6, bc. I was first taught that black should never ever play d5 here, d5, because it weakens the c5 pawn. And after d5, if white manages to get in d3, c4, he's always going to be strategically winning. I'm not so sure anymore. I've seen some recent games where black was going d5 in all kinds of positions here. So things are never that clear-cut. And yeah, I'm not up to date. b3 has been tried here a lot. I think that's the move Vichy tried against Gelfand. d3 seems to be played a lot. Queen e2. It's all very complicated, and it all depends on how black wants to arrange his pieces and how white reacts to it. Normally, I think black wants knight e7, knight g6, and f6, bishop e7, something like that. So this leads to very complex strategic play where I believe white has chances to get an advantage. It's just very, very hard for me to understand those positions. The other line is castles, knight g e7 here. I have some more experience. I've played this with black. Rook e1, a6, bishop f1, d5. I believe this is okay for black, but the assessment could also change. The main line was ed, knight d5, d4. Magnus Carlsen won a nice game here with white against Boris Gelfand, but later they found some ways to improve black's play or to spice it up a bit more. I don't remember, knight f6, bishop e3. What do? They take and go bishop d7, something like that. I'm not sure. It looked to me like black was holding his own, but it's certainly a playable line as well. And white even has some other options, like after d5. Someone once played e3 against me. I struggled a bit here too. So all of those are main lines and playable. Against e6, I believe it's a matter of taste. I like bishops, so I would probably go for castles. Bishop f1, it's a bit easier to understand these positions. While against d6, I believe bishop c6 is not great here, and white should start with castles. By the way, after g6, it seems like the consensus is that here is a good time to give up this bishop voluntarily, and this has become the main try. So really, that's where modern chess theory has been going. Players have to be so flexible that you might want to choose a completely different approach strategically against d6, e6, or g6. But yeah, things can always change. And it looks, in general, yeah, this exchange of the bishop doubling black's pawns, it's not a material sacrifice because these doubled pawns are quite a nuisance for black as well. Sorry, that was a long speech on the subject. I hope it helped a little bit. Finding more questions here. Oudramer. Senekaifi is asking about the Alekhine. Hi Jan, I just started with learning the Alekhine's defense. What a waste of time. Let's continue. And my question is about the position that occurs after 5e takes d6. I've checked, and it seems that most black players take back with the c7 pawn, but after some moves that looks quite dangerous to me. Is there any disadvantage by taking back with a pawn on e7? And what's the game plan after that? Thanks, Jan. It's always a pleasure to learn from you. Thank you. I'm flattered. I don't like the Alekhine, and I have a lot of practical experience here for a weird reason, which is that when I play bullet, I'm normally too lazy to not pre-move my first move. So when I play bullet games, I pretty much always pre-move one knight f6. Sometimes it goes well, they go d4 or c4 and I'm happy with it, but quite often they go e4 and I already have pre-moved knight f6. I can tell from experience that like 95% of white players, they do play exactly the system you've given. I'm not quite sure why. Knight f3 used to be the main line here, but everybody plays c4, knight b6, ed6 all the time. And I think with good reason. I think it's more pleasant for white, simply. I think you're right about cd. This, yeah, looks more logical, but white isn't time to go. Knight c3, bishop e3, rook c1, and black is suffering. Well, ed, this is the move I've played like a million times in my bullet and blitz games where I pre-moved one knight f6 out of sheer laziness. I always end up in a bad position. I don't like it. I think the main move and the move I always play is bishop e7. Then they go bishop d3 if they know their stuff. And the problem is just black is short of space, and this knight on b6 is really not very well placed against a pawn on c4. You try to get in some tricks, but they don't really work most of the time. Knight c6 here, I always hope for knight f3 when bishop g4 gives some counterplay. White normally goes knight to e2, and bishop g4 can be met with f3. And this position just seems quite unpleasant to me. Like, I've played it 100 times, I don't know why, out of sheer habit, and I'm never happy with what I get at all. So I can't recommend it, and therefore I can't really recommend the Alekhine. I'd suggest learn a different opening. If it has to be a sideline, look at, I don't know, the Scandinavian. I think that's a better bet than the Alekhine nowadays, like e4, d5. ed, queen d5, knight c3, and now queen d6 or queen d8. That's what guys do to avoid theory and get something easy to learn, and it's not so bad. But the Alekhine, the practical problem is everybody will play this d4, c4, ed6 stuff, and you'll get a slightly worse position after 4 moves without a lot of hopes for counterplay. So yeah, I've grown a bit wary of it. I'll still continue pre-moving one knight f6, but I'm never happy if I get in the Alekhine. I'm not sure how much that explanation helped, but I don't like this line for black at all, I gotta say. Next question coming in a second. Mr. Penty. Hi Jan. What's your take on e4, e5? By the way, do I read out the hi Jan if it's me reading it out? I'm not sure. I think I should, but I'm a bit conflicted on that question. What's your take on e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, long theoretical line, queen takes a8, knight d5. There we have a diagram, but we'll see it on my interactive chessboard in a minute. And he gives some lines. I'm always enjoying these, analyzing these sharp positions. I don't think this one is too relevant, if that makes sense. It's not. It's not irrelevant either, but I don't think any white players play like that. Let me just put it on the board. Sorry. Bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5, d5, ed, knight a5, bishop b5 check. All of this is quite well-known stuff. Bishop b5, c6, dc, bc. Here the trendy move, well, it was bishop e2, as Fischer used to play, and after h6, knight h3, which looks funny, and by now black has found ways to deal with it, it seems like. So the fashion has shifted to bishop d3. This is where the big theory discussions are going on. Knight d5 here, knight f3, either bishop d6 or knight f4 immediately, this kind of stuff. Knight c3, knight f4 castles. This is the line, I'm most curious about, where at the moment the theoreticians are arguing. Queen f3 never struck me as such a dangerous move, so I haven't spent much time on it. I thought black could just ignore it and go bishop e7 when I believe white is nothing better than going bishop d3. Taking this pawn looks quite dangerous. But cb5, that was a question. I thought it didn't work, but I'm not sure, and frankly, I haven't spent a lot of time analyzing it, and it does feel like it's a direction that could be interesting. Queen a8, knight d5. And the move that, I saw in my file was the move knight c3 here. That's what bothered me. Once again, I haven't checked it much. Knight c3, the point is you can't take because of d takes c, and white is just winning. Now the queen escapes easily. So the only move pretty much is the move knight to b4, if I'm not mistaken. When I had the impression white was better after castles, I couldn't find anything for black. However, black does have active pieces, and I wouldn't rule it out that you can find a way to find good compensation here, or maybe even more than that. Bishop e7, knight f3, castle. I didn't manage, but I didn't spend all that much time on it, as I said. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was something here for black. It doesn't look hopeless because the pieces are so active. And similar things I believe can be said about short castles, the move you mentioned, or d4. There's some hope here for black, but I don't think it's necessary, or at least for me I decided that it's not worth spending time here because first of all queen f3 is not popular, and secondly I was happy with queen f3, bishop e7, so I didn't feel the need to analyze it. But if you find out something and find out that it is good for black and that it is holding, by all means let me know. I didn't manage, but I also did not try all that hard. Not as hard as I'm trying to keep this tie where it should be in the show. It's gonna take like ages where my hands are off camera. It's not gonna be awkward at all with me trying to adjust things. Here we go. Let's find the next question. Panthy. I like these questions, by the way. I'm really into research of sharp, weird lines in e4, e5 stuff. And maybe I'll spend some more time on this position. I just didn't think it's relevant. The next question is very relevant by Bernie. Hi Jan, why has the Queen's Indian disappeared from top tournaments? Everybody, Kramnik, Adams, Leko, etc., even Karyakin after being defeated by Aronian, has moved to the Queen's Gambit declined. What are the problems, the critical lines for black? Do you still believe in the Queen's Indian? Or should I also investigate the Queen's Gambit decline instead? That's a very tricky question, and I've been asking myself the same thing for quite a while. I'm not 100% sure, of course, but I have some theories. First of all, I don't think the Queen's Indian has been refuted. It's a very sound way to start the game, and it's very logical. Look at the move. You put this bishop on a diagonal, which is obviously good, and white has a few different ways to tackle it, but it looks like in practice in super tournaments they've kind of settled that g3 is the critical try here. a3 for a long time has been considered to be not harmless, but white is very stuck after bishop b7, knight c3, d5. So this, yeah, we won't see much in super tournament practice. And knight c3 is not really an independent move. Bishop b4 is a line of the Nimzo a lot of people like, and bishop b7. White also doesn't seem to have a better move than a3. So this, yeah, isn't really trendy. But the move g3 is. And my theory why no one is going for the Queen's Indian anymore is that they used to defend this position after bishop a6. And I still think that's very possible. But the problem is that you have to cover a lot of ground if you play this with black. And in the computer age, this is a huge task because you have to be ready for many, many lines that are quite different in character and that are very sharp, where a lot of theory knowledge is required. Like, for example, queen c2, bishop b7, bishop g2, c5, d5. I think black is holding, or it's not like there is something that gives white a direct advantage in these positions, but there's a lot of different tries. They're all very sharp, and you really have to be extremely up to date to go here. And so this is a complex you have to keep working on and keep refreshing, even if you have perfect analysis here. To keep it all in your head is more or less impossible. And the problem is that's not the only white choice. White has like 5 moves here that are all relevant. b3 is the main line where you have to know a lot of stuff about all these lines after bishop g2 or knight c3 here, leading to quite complicated maneuvering plays similar to these cattle lines. Queen b3 is a move I have a bit of a soft spot for. It's an interesting move. Same thing with queen to a4. Recently, knight bd2 has also been coming into fashion. And all these moves have huge bodies of theory. I believe black is okay in all of them, and there's no real reason to give up the Queen's Indian. But on top level, I believe the problem is that it's just too big of a territory to maintain, and it's not like you get a structure or sharp play that you desire, because white can kind of choose the line here, and all of them are dangerous tries. So I believe it's more a practical choice that all the guys are playing d5 instead of b6. Because, well, there's also a lot of scope here, but in general you choose your line against the Catalan, and you choose your line after knight c3, be it bishop e7 or bishop b4 or c5, and you're more or less set. While in the Queen's Indian you have to know so much stuff if you go for the main lines. Because there's a huge amount of theory after bishop a6, a lot of guys have started to go bishop b7 or even bishop b4 check. I think that's what Magnus Carlsen has tried, but that's more of a surprise weapon. Bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop e7, where, well, it also hasn't been refuted, but this is a line I always felt like white should have decent chances to claim a bit of an advantage. I've always been a friend of this strange waiting move here, castles, rook to e1, not allowing knight c3, knight e4. And I still have the feeling that after rook e1, black's life is not so easy. I mean, if you end up in these d5, cd, ed structures, white is always a bit better. And here, well, I haven't seen any clear-cut ways to get a good position from black, even though I'm not going to claim white is winning here, but it looks like white still has a decent case to try for an opening advantage. And of course, there's alternatives, rook e1 as well. Knight c3, knight e4, bishop d2, you're going to see quite a bit. And you could also argue that white has some chances here. So long story short, I believe the Queen's Indian is by no means dead. I believe guys have just grown tired of defending all this territory there is to cover after bishop to a6. Even though you see people playing it, right? I mean, like Karyakin, he is playing it and more or less holding his own, but you need a lot of analysis and capacity for work. Or, of course, you can play it by ear, but that's dangerous, at least for the top guys. And that's why they switched to d5, where they think, whatever, the Ragozin is a bit simpler to learn, or the Queen's Gambit declined, I can play a bit more without knowing the latest details in these pawn sacrifice lines. That's at least my theory. I might be wrong. Maybe they just know something I don't. But if you look at the latest games, it's not like white is always hitting the same weak point. You see some of the guys play knight bd2, you see some queen c2, some b3. The games are all over the place, but that's also the problem for black. It's just a lot of ground to cover. So that's my theory. I could be very wrong about it. And as for the question, I wouldn't switch if you are happy with the Queen's Indian. And the good thing, if you're not a super grandmaster and playing against specific preparation every day, is also it's good for your chess if there's a lot of ground to cover. If you don't play the same structure in the Queen's Gambit decline every game, but here you get very different structures. You might be a pawn up in these Queen C2 sacrifices. You might get this C6, D5 structure in these B3 lines. You might get some sort of headshot position in these lines. So there is a lot of different structures and lines to learn and to play, but that's also good for not getting bored and learning something about chess. So I'm not against it at all. But it is what it is. It's not an easy line to master. Moving on to the next question. Let's see what it is. I need to find a smoother process to change the windows here. It's because I'm very clumsy, it takes a while. Here we are. Adam657 is saying, "Hi Jan, can you recommend to me what is the best way to deal with e4, c5, c3 for black? Thanks." These are tough questions. If you give me two moves and ask for best, that's always a tricky thing. But I can tell you what I'm doing against e4, c5, c3. Because believe it or not, I do sometimes play the Sicilian. And actually, I sometimes specifically chooses if I know that guys will play 2c3. I'm a lot more scared of the open Sicilians. c3, it's not a bad move, but I don't consider it to be that critical. Black has two main moves. I think they're equally strong. d5 is one of them, knight f6 is the other. I prefer the move knight f6 here. Might sound strange after I earlier trashed the Alekhine, but here having included c5 and c3 does make quite a difference. We already see white is not in time to occupy the center with c4 and d4 so easily. So yeah, there's quite some theory here, but my approach has always been simple. Wherever the move order is, I want to go take on d4 at the first chance and go e6. Normally you get this, then play d6 and kind of take it from here. You go bishop e7, castles. One thing to know is that after knight c3, knight takes c3, b takes c, queen c7 is an important move, attacking this pawn, and then knight d7 next. And I believe, the black is fine really. The most troublesome move is the move bishop c4. There have been other tries, but none of them really scare me. a3 is a move they used to play. Well, it looks strange, and black can even take the time to go bishop d7 and then bishop c6 with an excellent position. So I think bishop c4 is logical, bishop e7, castles, castles. Honestly, I don't know much theory here, but I like it for black, and I think black has easy play, getting the pieces out with knight c6, bishop d7 in many lines, or sometimes even with b6, bishop b7. I believe this is quite a playable line, and that's what I've normally been choosing. d5 is just as good, it's just a matter of taste. ed, queen d5, d4. There's always some trendy systems here, like recently I think stuff like this has been trendy, knight c6 and bishop f5. And then there's, the good old main lines, knight f6, knight f3, and either e6 and then knight c6, knight c6, or bishop to g4. I think both are playable. I prefer to knight f6. Covered in a lot of literature, and theory doesn't change that much there, so pick up a good book and find out. I believe this is fine for black. What else do I believe? Let's see the next question. Quitchy is saying, "Hey Jan, 2 questions." No, I'm sorry, you're only allowed 1. Those are the rules. You can see we're already in our end. So I'll go with the first one. Quitchy is saying, "Hey Jan, 2 questions. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, castles, knight takes e4, d4, a6. What to do here with white?" Let's bring it up. This can only take hours. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, knight f6, castles, knight takes e4. pretending to play the Berlin Wall. But now not knight d6, but the move a6. Yeah, this is another line I've given thought at a certain point in time. The answer is simple. White is nothing better than play the move bishop a4 here, transposing to the open Spanish after b5, bishop b3, d5, d takes e, bishop e6. And here you pick the move of your choice. Knight bd2 is the main line. Bishop e3 has quite some friends as well and might be easier to play. But I'd go knight bd2. And in general, yeah, I've thought about this move order if it has any practical advantages. But no one's really afraid of the open Spanish these days, so luring people into it didn't seem worth it for me. I mean, this is the normal move order, you reach it, and in order to avoid the open Spanish, white would have to go d3 or bishop takes c6. But no one does that, so they all play castles anyway, and you can go knight takes e4 here, and after d4 we got the same position. So yeah, this a6 move order trick didn't do it for me, but I don't think white is anything better than going for bishop a4 either. Bishop takes c6 gets tried once in a while, dc, queen e2 with sharp play, but black seems to be fine there. Bishop d3 does make a lot of sense, black just goes d5 and is up a tempo compared to some Petrov positions. So the answer is play bishop a4 and learn the open Spanish, or probably you learned it anyway because you must have a repertoire against 3a6, and for most guys the open Spanish is part of it. The only players against whom this move order makes some sense is guys who are comfortable playing the Berlin, but after a6 they would go bishop takes c6 every game. Similar to the question we had earlier, if you want to go f5 to spice it up here, against those guys you could consider that move order, but else, yeah, I don't think there's that much to gain from it, so I haven't dabbled with it much. What else we got? A lot of questions today. It's good that people are still interested in my rants about play the main lines, don't play side lines, play solid, don't play King's Indian, play the Queen's Gambit declined. I'm happy to see there is interest. Osiris is asking, hello Jan, I play the Berlin against 1 e4 when a draw with my opponent is not the end of the world. Okay, a lot of people do that. I would like to add a defense to my repertoire against e4 that avoids the possibility of white making a quite quick draw. Once again, I have to take issue with that claim. I might be wrong about this, but does it ever happen to you guys that you play your normal line and white just forces a quick draw in a flawless game? It never happens to me, so I'm not quite sure what it's about. Of course, I've also driven myself crazy with it a lot, and it's a common situation in open tournaments, for example. I'm black against a 2400 if I play my normal stuff. Is he going to force a draw? In my experience, it happens a lot less than we think it does, and I think there's a lot of play in many lines. However, of course, you do have a point, especially in the Berlin. There is the line with rook e1, I'll put it on the board later, where it's hard for black to generate winning chances. But even that position, you never know what happens. I think there's a lot of play in all these lines. So that's my standard rant, that you can play any opening. But the question is, I would like to choose from another line in the Ruy Lopez, if possible. What do you recommend for me? Please help me. And you're asking the right guy. I'm a big fan of the Marshall. Play the Marshall, watch my work on it, and you're good to go. It's a lot more exciting than the Berlin. But seriously, that's what, yeah, a lot of strong or super grandmasters even, they play the Berlin and they dabble with a6, bishop a4, knight f6, bishop e7, castles, bishop e7. I'm a fan of this. There's many other very playable systems. For example, b5, bishop c5 is a very decent setup, very sharp line. What's it called? I never know what it's called. Arkhangelsk, Muller, call it whatever you want. But this is very playable stuff. I hope I'm not putting too many spoilers out there. We have a video series on this coming by none other than Mr. Peter Svidler. Stay tuned. It's going to be in your Chess24 Learn section soon. So I'm very excited about that. I'm going to check Svidler's video series myself, and I might play it a bit more often. This is a playable line. And yeah, I've always been a friend of the Marshall. Check out my video series on the Marshall update. b5, bishop b3, castles, intending to meet c3 with d5. You could argue white can also force a draw here, I'm sure he can, as he can in all the sharp lines, but I've always had good results with it, and I'm willing to go for it most of the time. If you really want to keep more pieces on the board and play slowly, these old Spanish lines are still fully viable as well. Both the Briar, knight b8, knight b d7, and the Zaitsev with bishop b7, d4, rook e8. All of this is very playable stuff. Even though here, in fairness, white does have the move repetition, which is not so easy to avoid. And if you go h6, it's a bit worse. So maybe the Briar is a better choice to keep pieces on the board. That's what I've been doing quite a bit as well. So in general, my standard rant, all the lines are playable. Choose your poison, but I do hear your point that after knight f6, it's not that interesting to play after rook e1. Even in this position, there is some play left. I wouldn't call this a dead draw either, but I do understand that the potential is a bit limited here. So yeah, play the Marshal or play the Arkhangelsk, and you'll be set. You need something against the boring exchange Spanish, though, I'll admit that much. Speaking of exchange stuff, I believe we have another question on a line from exchange by Mr. Far Away from Hell. It's good to be far away from hell, I guess. He has a problem against 1 d4. So do I. I'm working on a new repertoire against it, but it is a pretty good move. There's no Berlins or Marshals. I don't have a repertoire against it. I switch between semi-dubious lines like 1 d6 followed by g6, bishop g7 and a6. d6, g6, bishop g7, I understand, but why a6? Play something else there, like knight f6. Some King's Indian sidelines or 1 f5, but my score against gambits there is very sad. Yeah, it's a repertoire a lot of guys have, like play g6, bishop g7 and see what happens, or mix in some Leningrad Duchess. Yeah, I've done that in my teenage years. I wasn't very happy with it. And yeah, I was happy when I moved to some more center-based openings, but that's just me. Some years ago, I played the Slav and semi-Slav, and I was satisfied with it. Same here. But then I lost the game against the exchange variation. That was the reason you gave up the Slav and semi-Slav? That sounds like a big thing to do. I don't have any idea how to play for a win with black in this variation. Therefore, I play dubious lines against weaker opponents. Sounds like a stretch, but yeah. But I'd like to stop that and play Slav, semi-Slav again. I like that plan. Do you have any good ideas against exchange Slav? Well, no bigger fan of the exchange Slav than me, as we know. But okay, let's think about this. So, you do like playing the semi-Slav, if I understood correctly. What I do a lot is after d4, d5, c4, I don't start with c6, not necessarily to avoid the exchange Slav, but also to avoid some other lines like knight f3, knight f6, e3. And instead I go for the move e6. White typically goes knight c3 or knight f3. After knight c3 I play c6. When, knight f3, knight f6, and we're back in our semi-Slav territory, they go e3, same thing, knight f6. There's the move e4, but that at least leads to very, very sharp, interesting play after de knight e4, bishop b4 check. So this kind of set has served me well. If I'm playing against weaker opponents and I want to avoid the exchange Slav, I normally start with this move order. And after knight f3, knight f6, once again, knight c3, c6, we get our semi-Slav. You gotta be ready for the Catalan here, but it's always important to adjust your move order to the opponent. So if you're afraid of the exchange Slav, then maybe don't start with d4, d5, c4, c6, but either d5, e6, or I also play a lot of d4, knight f6, c4, e6, and then if I think they're gonna go knight f3, I'll play d5 and still head for the semi-Slav. So that's my approach to answer the question though. A good line against the exchange Slav. First of all, I would have to know which exchange Slav. There's a lot of different variations of it. Knight c6, white can play with e3 or with knight f3. This is kind of the main branch. And of course black is not worse, but once again I would argue that there is enough ways to mix it up. For example, the move bishop g4 here. I don't think this is so easy to play for white. And yeah, the line people typically think of is knight f3, bishop f5, e3, e6, bishop d3 as the most drawn line on earth. And yeah, this is not very exciting, I'll admit that. Even though after bishop d3, even after takes and bishop e7, I'm not going to claim black is better, but I'd be confident I can outplay a weaker opponent from this position. There's still a lot of play on the queen side. Sometimes it's more about the mindset, just looking at the position and thinking, okay, what do we do from here? Instead of, oh my god, this is the exchange Slav. It's hopeless anyway, it's going to be a draw. And yeah, the problem is there are some sexier attempts, but I'm not sure how good they are. Like knight e4 is sometimes played here to spice up things. e3, knight takes, b takes c, g6, transposing more into Grunfeld kind of territory. I believe this is playable, but I believe white is a bit better. There's many ways to play here. a6 has been tried quite a bit as well. After e3, then bishop g4 is fine for black. After rook c1, well, people always experiment with different things. Like knight h5 is not a bad move here. And if bishop d2, e6. I believe this is not an easy line for white to play either. So my general point is don't give up your repertoire because of the exchange Slav. There is many ways to play, and it's not, well, I shouldn't say it's not the scariest of lines. I'm a friend of it with white myself. But for example, these two lines I just gave lead to quite unbalanced play. And I'll think about reshuffling your move order to avoid the things you're afraid of. That's one of my big topics, move order. Try to get your opponents into something they don't like. If you go e6 here after cd, ed in this structure, there's always plenty of winning chances just because of it being an asymmetrical structure. But yeah, once again, mindset. If it's an exchange Slav, it's an exchange Slav. Keep making good moves, and yeah, I think you're going to be all right. Let's get in some more questions. I feel like I'm repeating my same story again, even though I never ever win a game against 1d4. I keep preaching, just play boring stuff and you'll be fine. But yeah, what are you gonna do? That's what I believe. Indomable is repeating the question from earlier. I believe I've answered it to the best of my knowledge. Why did people stop playing the Queen's Indian defense? He's asking what are currently the best lines for white. I'm not sure. I think for g3 there is more or less consensus. But then after that, it's more that white has such a huge choice instead of what are currently the best lines. It's not like they keep hitting the same spot and causing black problems there, but they keep doing something else every game and causing black problems there. So rewatch my answer to the earlier question, and I think that will give an indicator for what I do consider critical. Pramod NVS is active as usual. Hi Jan, yeah. Will you please help me with when is black supposed to play d takes c4 in queen's gambit declines, and what are the positional advantages of that move? I can't answer these questions. Like, it's very hard. It's always some very unspecific, or I think Pramod is trying to grasp more concepts than direct positions, which is fine, but a question like what are the advantages of d takes c4 in the queen's gambit declined is impossible to answer because it could be in a million different positions. Like here, it's not a very good move, for example, because of e4. After knight f6, knight c3, d c4 is a very sharp line, which is called the Vienna, e4, bishop b4, with very sharp play. And sometimes later, it's also used to, relieve the tension, as in the line I was mentioning earlier, b6, bishop d3, bishop b7, castles. Here, black often goes dc4 to simplify a bit and free his bishop. So it's impossible to answer. You have to give me a specific situation because this, dc4 can be a good move, can be a bad move, can have advantages, can have disadvantages. General, abstractly speaking, it should be a bad move because the d5 pawn is a center pawn and you exchange it for a pawn, the c pawn, that is not quite a center pawn, thereby giving white 2 against 1 in the center. And black should keep his stronghold on d5. I hope that helps, but please, if you're looking to get something sensible out of me, try giving me a position or something a bit more specific. There are no sets of rules for all the openings or all the Queen's Gambit decline positions when to go dc4 and when not to. And there were some similar questions later on about rook e1, rook d1. I don't know. Chess is a very concrete game. It depends on the position. There one can weigh the advantages and disadvantages, but not as a set of rules when to go rook e1 and when to go rook d1. Or at least I don't know it. Maybe some people think like that, but I can't help you out there very much. Thanks for the questions though. K Lamar 74. I always praise K Lamar 74 for his username. Then I realized that Kendrick Lamar is already really old. He feels like such a newcomer, but if he's from 74, he's an old man. Since we're checking out people's ages today, let me just find out Kendrick Lamar's age. Speaking of Kendrick Lamar, did anybody like the new album? It's a bit abstract, isn't it? Okay. He's not born in 74. I was surprised. How could Kendrick Lamar be 41 or something? He is 27. That makes more sense. So, sorry, K Lamar, not 74. That was confusing. Anyway, let's get to the question. Hi Jan, it's great you're back with your fantastic shows. Thank you. Keep feeding me with praise and I might keep doing it. I love to play Banco Gambit with black. Yeah, don't do that. And I heard there is a 12a4 line that creates big issues for black. What variation is that and why is black busted? I think I've covered this in one of the last shows, which I'm sure you've studied in detail, so I can refer to that. Anyway, let's just very quickly bring it up again, but for more detail, check out, I don't know, opening clinic 4 or 3. We've had this exact question. So it's this line. Bishop g7, g3, castles, king g2, knight bd7. And here the move a4, and black seems to be struggling a bit, or I think I was saying in that show that I even like better to start with queen e2 to stop rook a6 and then go a4. So yeah, check this out from the last show. I'll be friendly and answer the second part of your question because I've already covered this one in another show, if I find the question back, which is a bit unclear by now. Here we are, sorry for the mess. If white avoids Banco with knight f3, yeah, that's what I always recommend. What should black play? CD, knight d4, e5, knight b5, d5 gambit. I like it and scores well. By all means, go for it then. I'm happy if people keep doing that. CD, knight d4, g6. Well, this is a topic I like, so I'll briefly bring it up on the board. Jesus, I'm getting really confused here. Here we go. d4, knight f6, c4, c5, knight f3. CD, knight d4. I play this position a ton, and I always hope for more people like K Lamar that like this gambit, e5, knight b5, d5, cd. I just don't think it's very good. Bishop c5, knight c3, castles, g3. And yeah, what can I say? I'm happy to play this position with white pawn up with a very, very sound position as far as I can tell. So I can't recommend it for black, but if you want to go for this, by all means, I'm very happy the more popular this becomes. Svidler's line is interesting, but I haven't spent much time checking it. He gave this g6, knight c3, d5. Looks a bit suspect is my honest opinion, but I haven't looked at it yet, and if Svidler recommends it, I'm sure it's not stupid. I would have to spend some time checking it out. I'm not an expert here. What do they do? Bishop f4, bishop g7, e3, or knight db5? Probably knight db5. I can't say. I haven't spent enough time here. But I'm not sure I trust it. I've always said, and I still believe that objectively I believe black should play this line, knight c6 and e6, or e6 and knight c6. But of course, I do understand if people say, yeah, it's not my position. However, I'm not sure it's anybody's position or not position. I believe it's more a bit fear of the unknown. Here, I'm not familiar with the patterns. It looks a bit wild after g3, queen b6. But I believe this is the best way for black to react, as I keep saying. Yeah, these g6 setups I'm not a big fan of. And what else? So you give e6, knight c3, bishop b4. This is possible. This transposes to the Nimzo. I've always liked this line for white, but not so much because it's a huge threat theoretically, but because I thought it was quite pleasant to play, really. But But this is a matter of taste. This is a perfectly sane line for black as well. This d5, or I shouldn't blunder, castles, bishop g2, d5 stuff. This is absolutely playable for black, so this, yeah, is a very possible choice as well. But yeah, it's a matter of taste. If you like the e5, d5 gambit, I've told you, and I've mentioned on the show many times, I think it's not very good. Have a look at the position after g3. If you come up with something, by all means. But if you like it, keep going for it. And yeah, knight c6, e6, in my opinion, is just the best line if we keep styles out of it, the type of positions. And yeah, this argument at club level, the gambit seems more fun. I don't know. Like, even at club level, I'd rather be a pawn up than a pawn down in that particular position. I'm not sure. It's not that simple. I like my martial gambits, but I can't change people's opinions. Play whatever suits you and whatever you think is fun. I'll just give you what I think is good or what I think is not good. Tam2 is saying, hi Jan, out of all the openings, I hate the French the most. Hate the French defense the most. Yeah, I can relate to that. The resulting positions don't make much sense to me, and I feel that black has excellent counter chances. Recently I started to avoid it with e4, e6, c4. What do you think about this idea? Let's have a look. As usual, I'm going to have to disappoint you. I relate very strongly with the first point. I also don't really understand French positions. And yeah, I'd never played with black, but I'm also... I think I would be uncomfortable. I'm not much of an e4 player if I had to face them with white. The problem is c4, I think, is just not very good here, is it? d5, I'm not sure what you want to do either. ed, ed, d4. This is sort of a harmless version of an isolated queen's pawn opening, and here black, to the best of my knowledge, has been doing pretty much all right. Bishop e7 or even bishop b4 here. I don't think this is a good line for white. And yeah, I don't know. ed, cd, knight f6 also seems fine for black to me. So c4 I never was very intrigued by. I mean, like, this ed, ed, d4 has to be playable. It's not like white is worse or anything. Knight f6, knight f3, or knight c3. But it seemed to me like black is doing all right there. I think what I would do, I'm not an e4 player, so I'm really not sure, but I think what I would do after e4, e6, d4, d5 is play this move knight d2. Like, objectively, in a chess truth kind of sense, I believe knight c3 is the best move, has to be the best move towards the center. But I hear you that I also wouldn't like these positions either after bishop b4 or knight f6. So knight d2, I always thought it's a bit easier to relate to these positions after c5, ed, queen d5. I think this is fine for black, but here at least it doesn't look like such a locked up pawn structure, and there's some play with this line or also with dc5. Or c5, knight f3 immediately. All of this stuff, yeah, at least it's more relatable to positions I'm familiar with. Knight f6 is a bit different, but here I think, yeah, normally players like to play this stuff with white. Bishop d3, knight e2, knight f3. This seemed like there's some decent chances for an opening advantage here. So I would be, if I was an e4 player, I would be going for a 3 knight d2. I think we have a new video series out here, a little plug by my boy Lawrence Trent, who got some praise for his coverage of the Tarrasch, the knight d2 French. That's a place where I would look. As for e4, e6, c4, d5, I can't claim much expertise, but I've once in a while prepared for it with black through another move order if they go c4, e6, e4, and I've always come to the conclusion that it's not very good after d5. And c5 is a move here too, by the way, which is quite serious, but d5 I always thought this is one of the best versions black can get from all these isolated queens pawns positions. So I'm sorry, I'm not a fan, but I am a fan of not liking the French defense. Senior1 is saying, hello Jan, to surprise my opponents in Blitz, I like to go into somewhat more exotic openings. What do you think of the opening in the English c4, g5? I've been told it isn't that easy to counter. I'm not sure who told you that. Maybe Richard Rapport. c4, g5, I think that means 2d4, bishop g7. Okay, some line. Knight c3, h6, bishop c5. Yeah. Some tricks there. Are there no other cheap openings like the fret that are totally unsound but tend to bring your opponent out of balance? I'm not quite sure I understand your question, frankly. Do you want me to give other unsound openings that you can play in blitz, or do you want me to comment on c4, g5, which is, yeah, it's terrible, not surprisingly, but I'm sure Richard Rapport would approve. The problem with it, though, I believe white is just kind of winning here by taking the pawn, right? I know this is the trick you're hoping for with bishop takes g5, c5, but after knight f3, as far as I can see, white is winning in this position. So I'm not sure. Well, once again, I understand it's a surprise weapon for blitz, and by all means keep doing it, but I don't like it much, even in blitz. I don't think it would irritate me that much, and I just would feel crappy having my pawn on g5, but that's very much a question of style and approach, and I believe you shouldn't ask me, you should study the games of Richard Rapport, or to a lesser extent Bardur Jabava, but especially Rapport. He has a soft spot for g4, he's played a lot of e3, followed by c4 and g4, and with black we've also seen him do a lot of g5, h5, and he does make it work. So for slightly goofy opening ideas with a point, I believe studying Richard Rapport games is an excellent starting point. And else, yeah, for teaching the merits of c4, g5, you're gonna have to convince me that black is not hopelessly lost after just bishop g5, c5, knight f3, because I think it doesn't look very good. Here we go. Now we even got the position on the board that I was talking about. Knight f3, bishop g5. It's just, it doesn't work. But yeah, I understand this is not supposed to be a theory discussion, but a way to confuse your opponents in blitz. However, from my opening doctor hat, I have to disapprove of the move g5, because we can't take it c5, knight f3, and nothing seems to work for black really. cd, knight d4, queen b6. I don't even know how the line goes. Bishop e3, I think. And yeah, this position didn't really inspire any confidence. Was it bishop e3? Oh no, you go knight b5 here, I'm sorry. See, you would have confused me already. Knight b5, bishop takes b2, knight 1 c3. And it's pretty much an uphill struggle. Or knight b5, a6. Now bishop e3. I mean, there's some subtleties which any computer will spit out instantly. So it doesn't quite work, which, yeah, is not a surprise. But by all means, keep doing it in blitz if it makes you happy. I'm not going to approve of the move g5, but others might. How many questions we got? We're already going forever. There's a lot of chess theory out there. Senior 1 posted a position. Yeah, this looks like the best case scenario for g5 stuff. Even here, I think, looks winning for white in this position, if you ask me. But it does look like you're having fun with it, so I don't want to discourage that too much. Next question by Rensburger. Hi Jan, I need some advice for white in this standard... Sorry. In this standard position of the Queen's Gambit that can come about via different move orders, knight f3, d5, d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Here we get the position. What is your recommendation for the average club player? Average club player in bold, so I am supposed to take that fact into account. I'm not really lazy, but knight c3 looks like way too much work, at least for an amateur. I don't know, first I'm going to give my usual speech. You should by all means go knight c3, because it's the best and most flexible move. And yeah, if you are mildly interested in openings, and if you're an amateur, most of the time you're facing other amateurs and not well-prepared super grandmasters. And if you do, you're probably screwed anyway, no matter what you play here. So I would very much recommend going knight c3, just because I think it's the best move and it keeps the most options. I understand black has a huge choice there, but it's not like in every game you have to be prepared for bishop e7, dc4, bishop b4, c6, c5, and so on and so forth. And it's much better for your chess if you keep getting mainline positions and spend some time on them and check the options then if you go for e3 every game. So that's my standard speech. I think you should absolutely go for it without being afraid of running into too many main lines. Now let's get to the alternatives. The main alternative is playing the Catalan with 4g3. Of course, that's a perfectly viable alternative. However, especially since for the average club player was in bold, I would not recommend the Catalan. I would really recommend 4 knight c3. First of all, I think it's easier to play because you have more fluent piece development. Like let's say bishop e7, you go bishop f4 or bishop g5. Just c6, yeah, you go e3 or bishop g5. After c5, okay, you take and go e4. All of this stuff is, yeah, to my mind, a lot more easier to understand. After dc4, you go e4, and then either bishop g5 or bishop takes c4. It's a lot more direct and easier to understand than the Catalan. Well, once again, to my mind. And I also think some of these Catalan positions, they are really hard to get, at least for me. If black grabs the pawn, you either have to know a lot of theory, more than you would have to know by just playing normal moves in the main lines, to make sure you reclaim the pawn, or you would have to be really confident in positional nuances here. So it's not something I'm that inclined to, but I haven't touched the Catalan for a while. I used to play it a bit more, so I could be biased here. I'm not sure. It's obviously a perfectly playable opening, and it's still a problem for black. We do see it at the top level. But yeah, my advice would be to go knight c3 without panicking too much about I need a repertoire against the 15 different black moves here. And once again, I like toying with the move order as well. If I feel like my opponent does something strange here, I'm going to start with d4 and then knight c3 or with one c4 to avoid giving him too wide a choice. Still, let's try to answer the question. c4, e6, knight f3, d5, other alternatives. e3 is a playable move. I think I've mentioned in my video on my Thailand games where Josef Horvath played this move e3 against me. It's not bad, it's a bit dull and it doesn't put as much pressure on black as knight c3. And you can kind of tell that by just looking at the position. Knight c3 develops a knight to the center and all the pieces can still get out. Well, e3 locks in your bishop and doesn't do all that much. So I've played it once in a while. I've never felt good about myself, and my opinion theoretically is that bishop e7, black kind of has an easy game and should be alright. It's okay to avoid any theory and just play a game or avoid a lot of theory, but I believe you're going to have more fun if you go knight c3. Bishop g5 is similar. That's a move normally if strong players chooses it's with a very specific purpose to, for example, avoid this line. At some point they were getting annoyed by this scimitar rush and they tried to stop it and started going bishop g5. I don't know, I don't do this much, mainly because after h6 you have to give up your bishop on f6, which I'm not a big fan of. Like, this is playable stuff, but you're kind of limiting yourself to playing this position, which, yeah, I don't think is that great for white, so I wouldn't do this necessarily. And also bishop g5 doesn't cut out that much stuff. I mean, you still have to be ready for bishop e7, and you've committed your bishop to g5 without getting the option of going bishop f4, which I think is a more interesting system. You still have to find a way to deal with dc4. So I'm not against it. Bishop g5 is playable, especially if you want to meet the queen's gambit with bishop g5 lines. I don't do it much because I don't enjoy the positions after h6. So yeah, just go knight c3. Play the main lines. Your opponents won't know much either, and you'll just be able to make more natural moves and put your pieces on good squares. What's the next question? Thomas Legend is saying... Oops, sorry, wrong screen. This is tough stuff. Hi Jan, what do you think is the best continuation for black to deal with e4, c5, to knight c3? Is a6 playable? I'm a Najdorf player. I think it's playable, absolutely. Once again, switching to the board. e4, c5, knight c3. Yeah, your choice here depends on your repertoire against the mainline Sicilians. If you are a, whatever it's called, calm player, then you kind of have to go knight c3, e6, which is a fine move, because you don't want to be outmaneuvered. Let's say you play knight c6 and your opponent plays knight f3 or knight e2, followed by d4, and you can't reach your position anymore. Similarly, I think that's why you're asking. As a Najdorf player, here you don't want to go knight c6, because after knight e2 or knight f3, it's tough to get to the Najdorf. A lot of Najdorf guys, they still play this, and here they play g6, mixing in some accelerated dragon where white doesn't have the chance to go d4, which I think is a legitimate move order or approach to the opening as well. But yeah, as a Najdorf player, if you want to reach your Najdorf, you have a choice between d6 and a6. I don't know, like, I think d6, f4 is a little scary. I believe theoretically black is fine there. But I understand the reasoning behind a6 after g3 now, or after f4 you can go b5 immediately. And I believe these positions are a bit weird, but they do strike me as playable. Bishop g2, bishop b7. Normally it's some strange positions, really. d3, e6, even g6 here. Why not g6? I'm not sure this is so bad. e6, f4, d5. It's confusing stuff. It's very freestylish, so you would have to be comfortable in a position where there's like no typical direct guidelines. But theoretically, I think it's fine, and it is, as you said, consistent with your Najdorf repertoire. So a6 does make a lot of sense. Me, I'm not much of a Najdorf player. If I play Sicilian, it's more dragon or knight c6, e6 stuff. So I've always been happy playing knight c6, and after f4 just going for this e6 line, which I've recommended, knight f3, d5, where I think black is fine. But yeah, as I think you're fully aware of, your move after 2 knight c3 should depend on what you want to play in the open Sicilians. Alright, we got a couple more questions. I'm not sure how long I'm going to be able to keep going. Sorry. Switching once again. Oh, sorry, I'm going to have to ignore your second question, Thomas Legend. Strict rules, I can only answer one per person. Flow Power is saying, hey Jan, nice to see you in Villingen. Oh yeah, I'm going to the German Youth Championship on, when am I going, on on Sunday, I think. He has a question concerning the London system. Do you think there's any chance to play for an opening advantage after a d4, d5, bishop f4, knight f6, knight f3, bishop f5, e3, e6, without playing the move c4? No, you should play c4, and white is better. According to my database, the main move here is bishop d3, but this can't be it, as you're exchanging your good bishop. Yeah, I agree, bishop d3 is not very scary. If you stick to c4, what should be the setup for white to get an advantage? If black just plays normal moves like bishop e7, castles, knight bd7, etc. It's not that easy to just play normal moves. d4, so what move order was that? So confusing. Yeah, here we are, d4, d5, or let's say bishop f4, knight f6, knight f3. By the way, I think the main argument against all these systems is that black is in time to play c5 here or after e3 and should be alright. I don't think bishop f5 is a problem. e3, e6, yeah, c4 is the way to go here. I agree with you on bishop d3, it's not very scary. But now, white is already ready to go queen to b3, so it's not so easy for black to just keep developing. Knight d7 would be met by queen b3. So black normally starts with c6, knight c3, knight bd7, and here once again queen b3. This I'd be very happy to play with white. If I knew I was getting this, I'd play the London system every game, but I don't think you do get this all that much. Queen b6 here and c5. This is kind of the key point. Queen takes b3, a takes b. And these endings, I think, favor white. It's a very simple plan to go b4, b5. Black kind of has to go a6, b4. Now b5 is a threat. You have to go rook to c8. But yeah, this is unpleasant. White goes h3, knight d2, knight b3, knight a5 is always a plan. And black is, yeah, I play this with white very happily. So that's pretty much all I got. White is better there. Go c4 and enjoy life. But it's a very different scenario after c5, because here if you play in Londonish style, all of a sudden black could employ the same kind of setup. Queen b3, c4, takes. And of course it's worse since black is tempo down or two, but even that I think is quite playable for black. So I hope that answers your question to some extent. Luke71 is once again asking too many questions, but I'll answer the first one. He does like Chess24. Thank you. Always happy to see new premium members who are happy with what they're getting. We're trying to provide a lot of stuff for everybody. And me wearing my tie flawlessly is not a part of it. So let's answer the first part of his question. What is the best way to play for white after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5, d5, takes, knight f7, and so on and so forth. I think I should put it on the board, not to confuse myself and everybody else. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5, d5, e takes d. We've had a question earlier about knight a5 in this position, which is the main and best move. Well, you could argue about that, but this is the main move. And yeah, I think the best one is 2. And knight takes d5 is the question. I'm gonna take the liberty to not really answer it, but talk about this position. After knight takes f7, king f7, I believe play is not so clear, and black has his chances. Queen f3, king e6, knight c3. There are some games once in a while by romantics or players who like sharp positions. I think Shirov won a game here against, who was it? I can't remember. Shulskis. After knight c3, knight cb4, a3, knight c2, king d1, knight a1, knight takes d5 with a total mess, king d6, d4. I have no idea who's better and why. This looked very dangerous for black, who might be able to hold his own. But what I don't understand is, or at least I was taught after knight takes d5, knight f7 is not the best move. Well, white should just go d4 and he has a pleasant advantage. And yeah, I checked if something has changed here, but it doesn't look. So I would not really lose any time on knight takes f7, but just go d4 here. The point is that after ed castles, black's position is way too exposed. And if you play a normal move here, like bishop e7, now knight f7 sort of does win. King f7, queen h5 check. If king e6, rook e1, it's game over. Well, this would be kind of a quick mate, actually. So d4, black is not really in time to go ed4 or knight d4 because of c3. It's also bad. I believe what they have been playing is bishop to e6. It looks strange, and if you switch on the computer here, it's just going to say castle and be extremely happy with the white position after ed4. I think it just wants rook e1, and it's going to claim already a close to decisive edge here as well. Queen d7. Once again, here knight takes f7 works. So I believe this is the way to go. King f7, queen f3. This is a cute line, so I'll just put it on the board. And king g8, rook takes e6, overloading this diagonal. All of this looks very good for white. Small disclaimer, I haven't studied this very seriously or in detail, but I did once check if there was anything I thought black could do after d4 here, and I wasn't all that impressed with what I saw. So I would think that the complications after knight f7 aren't strictly necessary, and just play d4 and you're gonna have a good time. But most guys are aware that knight takes d5 is not the way to go, and they will play knight a5. And this is the line you really have to be ready for. Hope that helped. Spending too much time, right? We're way over our time budget here. So, thanks Luke71. Sorry, I can't answer the second part. Strict rules here. Discombobulated is asking, Hi Jan, what do you make of this line? e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, f4, d5, fe, knight e4, d3. I have an opinion on that. Oops. Yeah, I don't think this line is very scary. I think there's no reason to investigate this sharp stuff, which is probably not good either with bishop b4 or queen h4. You just take on c3 and play d4. And I believe black is slightly better. So yeah, that's my unromantic approach to knight f3, knight c6. And I'm sure there's a lot of theory books filled analyzing like these exciting complications, but black is just better. So it's not a serious line. And you will see that if you check it, that some guys, once in a while, give it an outing, but you're never gonna see it as a regular weapon for a strong grandmaster, because this stuff just doesn't work. This is the theoretical line. I studied this line once. Bishop d4 here is fine, but also knight to d4. I think black is just better, so there's no reason to avoid these lines. Some other line after d4, knight f3, knight c6. I think something like cd, bishop b4 check, bishop d2. Takes, and knight takes d4. I think black is also slightly better here. So yeah, that's all I know from the black perspective, but I'm quite happy with that amount of knowledge, and I don't think 3f4 is very serious, but especially 5d3 is not going to pose a lot of problems. If white plays this, he should try knight f3, when I believe bishop c5 is a good move. Moving on, I'm sorry, we're under a lot of time pressure here, so I'll start speaking extra quickly. I'm not going to start switching the screens any quicker though. Gior is asking, I need to win with black against someone who plays color system d4, 2 knight f3, 4 bishop d3, 5 c3. Should I play King's Indian, Queen's Gambit decline setup, or something else? Does he always play exactly those moves, or just the general setup? If he goes for this stuff exactly, then of course you should exploit it. And after d4, knight f6, knight f3, play d6. And if he goes e3, go knight bd7, planning e5, and if he naively goes e5, bishop d3, you go e5, and you threaten e4, and you pick up the piece. But yeah, seriously, I think he's probably gonna spot that. Still, these early d6, knight d7, e5 ideas are not dumb against creatures of habit who always do stuff like that, or put the bishop on f4. And yeah, my approach would be just to play normal stuff, but that's because I'm a d4 player, and even with colors reversed, I feel quite comfortable in a position like that. I don't know, he would probably go c3, and I don't know what I would do, queen c7, bishop d3, bishop g4, or maybe cd, ed, bishop g4, and play this position. Put my knight on c6, go e6, bishop d6, play some sort of Queen's Gambit reversed. And I'd be happy with that, but it's very much a matter of taste and what positions you prefer. Nothing wrong with a King's Indian setup either if your opponent goes d4, knight f3, e3, bishop d3. Especially because, yeah, once again, he might run into some trouble with you threatening to win a piece later on after, let's say, d6, knight c6, e5 or something like that, or knight bd7, e5. So I play Queen's Gambit decline setup and make sure not to lock in my bishop with e6. I don't like going e6 here ever. My goal is always getting this guy out, and I'd be happy with it. And yeah, just do that and you'll be fine. Okay. Dr. Boki is saying, hi Doc Jan, so what do you consider the best line for white? d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, e3, a6, knight c3, bishop f5. Is the line after 6 queen b3, b5, c5, a5 okay for black, or can I can't speak anymore, this is the last question. Or can white get an advantage? How tough can it be? Let's have a look. Yeah, this is a bit of a pet line of mine. I've played this quite a bit with both colors. I always liked the surprise value, but now it's gone. A6, knight c3. Of course, the main moves here are b5 and e6, but I had a soft spot for bishop f5. I'm not sure what the best line is. Magnus Carlsen famously played bishop e2, h6, bishop d3 against Nakamura and won. Honestly, I think queen b3 is a critical move, and I think, to answer the second part of your question, and after b5, c5, a5, black is doing all right. At least when I was checking this, I wasn't all that scared of this position. Black goes a4, g6, and he was holding his own as far as I could tell. I would thought what's very interesting, I'm not sure if best, but I thought very dangerous for black was to go for this old line, cd, cd, a4. Black is forced to sacrifice a pawn here, more or less, with b4, else his position is terrible. Queen takes b4, knight c6, queen c5, knight a5. All of this is more or less forced. Bishop takes a6, and this just leads to hellish complications where black has to be extremely careful. Rook a6, queen b5, rook c6, knight e5, bishop d7, knight takes. Yeah, this is a position you can have a lot of fun in by clicking a lot with your engine. I believe the computer will probably hold this for black, but try defending it over the board. I don't know, king takes d7, e4. It's not going to be a lot of fun. So I think this is a very critical and serious test of this a6 bishop f5 line, and if I had time to prepare for it, and if I hadn't told it on this show, that's probably what I would do. So yeah, I believe this is a good spot to look for an advantage. This is the last question I prepared for. I will briefly update the site and see if there's more come in. I'm not promising to answer them all, but I'll just have a look. In general, make sure to post your questions like at least 1-2 hours before the show, because else I'm not going to be able to get through all of them. And yeah, there's like 5 more. I'll answer them rapid fire style. Jack Bauer, FIDE Master. Wow, Jack Bauer is a FIDE Master too. Jan, probably have looked at this, so I'm curious, what is your opinion on White's chances in Rajabov's Queen's Gambit accepted variation? I've never seen this position in my life, that's the honest truth. Is this a game they've recently played? I have no clue. I would have to look it up. I'm sorry, like, I've never seen this position. Knight takes e5. Let me bring up the website so people know what I'm talking about. This is the Jack Bauer question I was reading out. d4, d5, c4, dc, e4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop d3, knight c6, knight e2, bishop g4, bishop e3, queen d7, knight bc3, long castles, a4. I don't know. I would have to check, and it would take some time. a4 looks strange. If it allows knight e5, my gut reaction would be it's probably nothing for white. But yeah, I've never spent time there. I'm not much of a 3e4 guy against the Queen's Gambit accepted. But I should become one. So sorry I can't help you there, Jack Bauer. Next time, give me a little more time. 24 hours maybe. That was funny. Cicerone is saying, "Hi Jan, my question is slightly different from those by others. How should a complete beginner, so someone who knows basic tactics and strategy with little knowledge about the openings, learn them? I barely know a few openings and have no idea how to play against. How to start? Just by watching videos here on Chess24. Do you know any decent opening books for complete beginners?" I'm not a good source to ask there, I'm sorry. As you can imagine, I haven't read a lot of beginners opening books recently. I think on Chess24 we have some decent videos that are also useful for beginners, and you shouldn't be so focused on studying move by move lines, but more on learning the principles. For example, we have a great series by, I think, Vishy Anand, explaining opening principles for beginners, like what do you want to look for in pieces and how to get them out. Else, I'm sorry, I just don't know my way around the book market for beginners, and this might sound strange, but it's very hard for me to relate to these problems, because yeah, when I was a beginner, I was like 8 years old and I was just reading every chess book I could get my hands on, but I never had a plan. I need to study this, or this is a decent opening book. I had some German book called Kasparov's Chess Openings as a kid, or Kasparov's Schacheröffnung, and that helped me. I just copied everything that was given in the book Then gave up the King's Indian once I understood it's not for me. But that helped me. But in general, if you like chess, just play and check your games. If the openings bothered you or where it went wrong, and read whatever you can get your hands on, and you'll get better. And we do have a lot of great material, I think. Check out this Vichy series, Vichy Anand, the former world champion, on opening tips, and see if that helps you. Energy382 saying, "Hi Jan, my question is about the Queen's Gambit declined after the classical d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e7, knight f3, knight f6. I like 5 queen c2 as a surprise weapon. Nowadays everybody plays bishop f4. I've played queen c2. What do you suggest after queen c2, c5, dc5, d4? White is a very good score in the queen c2 variation, but especially d4, knight b5, e5 annoys me. By the way, I used to play knight takes e5, but then a6. I couldn't find an advantage in my 2 games played so far in this line." Played 2 games in that line? Wow. Once again, I'm the wrong person to ask, but I think I once prepared this a little bit. Let's just briefly put it on the board and switch on the computer. That's normally how I prepare everything. Briefly put it on the board and then ask the computer's opinion. But as you mentioned, it's a surprise weapon. So if you've played it twice already, aren't you losing a bit of the surprise character? Queen c2, there's also castles, which I once had a game against Rasmus Svan, it didn't get much. And yeah, the c5 is considered to be topical. I think castles sounder, frankly. dc5, d4, I don't know, I wasn't that impressed with it. Knight b5, e5, I know this is given as the theoretical way to play. Knight takes e5, a6. But when I was checking this, I thought knight a3, I believe, was favoring white. I'm not sure, I would have to check it a bit more. I haven't looked at it for a long time. But I thought something like this was nice for white. Castles, I don't know, what do you do? Knight d3. Can't remember details, frankly. And as mentioned, it's a surprise weapon. I don't think white would get all that far playing it all the time. But it is certainly worth a shot. Here we got the position. Queen c2, c5, dc, d4, knight b5, e5, knight e5, a6, knight a3. I think that's what I wanted to do in the old days, knight d3. But I'm not really up to date, I gotta say. So yeah, it's worth trying, but in general, in my opinion, or in my experience, if you surprise people with queen c2, most of them are gonna play the logical move castles, and if they're gonna see that you played this already and go c5, d4, they will probably be ready for it. Let's see how many more questions we do have. Senti123 saying, "Hi Jan, today I will play with a lower player and he plays the Petrov and I don't like the main lines. Do you think the Cochrane Gambit is playable at 2200 till 2300 level? Or would you suggest I play 3d4? Now my suggestion would be as boring as ever. Play the main line. Go knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, knight c3. He's going to take on c3. You take back with a d pawn. Then you go bishop e3, queen d2, long castles, and you take it from there. You have a good position. Your king is safer. And no matter how much theory your opponent knows, he can't hurt you there because you're slightly better with a sound position. I think knight takes f7 doesn't work. There's a forced draw after, I don't even know, but there was a couple forced draw which your opponent probably knows. And 3d4 is playable, but knight takes e4. There's less chances for an opening advantage than in the other line with knight e5. So yeah, that would be my suggestion. Best of luck for your game. Senti123. And last question for today by Kevin Connolly. Is that the guy from Entourage? I think it is. Kevin Connolly. It's the guy who plays the agent, right? Anyway, hi Jan. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, g4. What has happened in this line? I never see the position after bishop b4 anymore. All seem to end up playing b6 for a Queen's Indian game. Is this a case of black just avoiding it? Is this why Lawrence Trent asked about g4 on the first move some time ago? No, he asked about g4 because he was trying to be funny, which normally doesn't work all that well. It's a terrible move on the first move. And the line you're giving with 4 g4, yeah, I think it's playable. Then after d5, I thought black was kind of doing all right there. I believe this 4 bishop b4, no, 3 bishop b4 is a little out of fashion because of the move 4 queen c2 when white gets a good version of the Nimzo Indian with queen c2 where he hasn't committed to d4 yet. I think that's the reason we don't see it that often, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it come back. And yeah, I can't share your experience. I don't see a lot of guys going b6 in that position, more on the second move, but not on that one. Anyway, I'm sorry I was rushing through the last couple of questions, but we've been going for 2 hours and I don't think anybody's awake out there anymore. Plus, I also really need to loosen the tie. That's the problem with wearing a tie and speaking. It does strangle you slowly. So I would like to thank everybody for participating. Thanks for your patience with me clumsily switching the windows and once in a while forgetting. Also, apologies for ignoring the chat, but there's always so much chess to talk about and so many open lines to get through. It's been a blast. I enjoy doing these shows. I know my advice is always play the main lines, but that's because I believe in it. And thanks everybody for watching. I will see you for the next show, whatever we do it on and when we do it on. I'll be headed off to the German Youth Championship on Sunday. Check out what's going on there. But I will come back. Thanks for watching and see you next time around. Bye-bye. Let's clumsily switch to the stay tuned screen before we turn this off.